Hi everyone, it's me. Today's lesson is going to be on human variation, and really the main thing I'm going to be discussing on this lecture is the pedigree analyses. So I've got a board, and we'll see how well this goes. And so I'll just kind of as we walk through the examples in the PowerPoint, I'll show them to you guys on the board. So we can just jump right in to that. Before we do the first example together, just a little background. So in general, the pedigree is going to trace like certain things through a family tree. Now, if you have ever done maybe like a family tree for like a sociology course or like maybe a cultural anth course, who you add to the family can go beyond people who are like blood related to you, right? But for this class, I mean, you're not doing your own, but in terms of the individuals that we're talking about, it's going to be people that are blood related because we're only tracing like biological genetic things. So it could be we're tracing a trait that like a disease, an allele for a disease or a color of the hair. It's all going to be like physical traits. So sometimes the wording, like if the way I've worded it in the PowerPoint, or sometimes the wording like in the book might say something like, Joan and Mark are in a sexual relationship, not necessarily married, although like they might say that, but usually it's a reference to the fact that they're in a sexual relationship and have offspring, right? So because we could be making these charts about humans, we could be making these charts about plants, we could be making them about rabbits or frogs, so just kind of keep that in mind that the terminology might be a little more, that might be a little different. So, like I've said before, if you're following along the PowerPoint, I usually kind of hit the main points, but I'm not going to go bullet point for bullet point necessarily. Some of them I do, some of them I don't. Anyway, so if you're looking at basically, I think it's like the first or second slide, you'll see like a kind of example pedigree, and you'll see there's like circles and squares, and some are colored in and some are not. That's the general rule, that whenever we have a male, we use a square, and then whenever there's a female, we use a circle. And then for whatever trait we're tracing, like I said, which could be a disease or just like a certain type of hair color, whatever physical trait, genetic trait we're looking at, individuals who express that trait phenotypically, so they actually show that trait, like they have that disease or they have that hair color, then those are the individuals who we say are like affected, and they will be shaded in. So if you're looking at just the chart, even if you haven't looked at like the details, you'll be able to see, oh, like that person and that person and that person are showing that trait, whatever it is, they're showing it like phenotypically on the outside of their body. Now, of course, we know sometimes genetics and what you actually see on the outside can be a little tricky, right? So this is where we're going to use some of those rules of dominant versus recessive, for these. So I think I've got 3 or 4 examples. I don't know if we'll do all of them. Well, let's just see. Oh, and then just to reiterate some of the lines, a line that goes like between 2 people horizontally is like a mating, and then if there's a drop down, that indicates like their offspring. And as we go through these, I think it's going to be, what's the word? Thinking of like obvious. I'm thinking of a different word, but it's going to be pretty obvious as we go through. It should make sense to you. It's like it's logical. Okay, so let's jump into the first one, which is Greg and Lauren. So let me find. I got a bunch of pens here. Let me find a smaller pen so I have, because I'm not writing on a giant board in class, right? Okay. Now let me turn a little bit. Okay, so here we have the board. There might be a glare at some points. I'll try to, make sure you, oh, see, I'm like moving the wrong way. I'll try to make sure that it's seeable, Okay, so let's start out. We've got Greg and Lauren. And so remember, males are square, females are circle. So we can start at the top and then we'll work our way down if they have, any offspring. So we've got, let's see if I can do this in an odd angle. We've got Greg, and you should label, if it gives you a name, write the name. Sometimes it might not. It might just say, Maria mated with a man. Then you would just put the square. But if there is a name, you should always put the name. So we've got Greg, and then a circle, for Lauren, and then Lauren. So we've got Greg and Lauren. Hopefully this is intuitive. That's the word I was thinking earlier. Hopefully it's intuitive so far. Greg and Lauren are in a relationship. And the example says they have 2 children, Olivia, a female, and Tommy, a male. So we're going to, from their middle line, we're going to drop down. This is going to indicate offspring they have. Now, if they just had 1 offspring, we would just put this shape right there. But because they have 2, we're going to, split that. And they've got a male and a female. And then we've got Tommy over here and Olivia over there. Pretty simple so far. Then it gives us a little bit more info. It says Tommy has a son with a female. So it doesn't give us her name, but obviously we know that, well, I mean, assuming we're talking about humans, right? We are a sexually reproducing species, so no one's cloning themselves. So we've got a female over here for a mating for Tommy. And they have 1 son, so no name on the son either, but obviously we know that we can write a square, so we've got mystery female, mystery son, and everyone else has a name. Hopefully, so far this makes sense. And of course, the nice thing about these video lectures is that you can always pause and go back and, double check your understanding. Okay, so then it gives us some more info about the trait. It tells us Lauren is affected by whatever trait this is. So remember, if the example says they're affected, that's telling us that they are whatever trait it is, they are showing it phenotypically, and that's like what we're tracing, right? So Lauren is affected, and it's telling us, doesn't tell us what the trait is. It could be anything, but it's telling us that it's a dominant trait. So as a note, always remember that, because how you end up labeling everyone is going to be dependent on if it's a dominant trait or if it's a recessive trait. You're often going to have a little difference in how everyone gets labeled at the end, which is always like the last question. So remember this part. Okay, so we know it's affected trait. We know it's a dominant trait, and Lauren is affected. So we're going to shade Lauren in. Okay, that's good enough. Lauren is shaded. And what else? And so are Tommy and his son. So they are also affected. So let's shade in Tommy and then Tommy's son, right? Then the example lets us know that no other family is affected for clarity. So it's just those 3 individuals out of this family of 6. And then the very last bullet point. What are the genotypes for each individual? Remember, for genotypes, there are 3 options. You can be homozygous dominant, 2 dominant, right? 2 dominant alleles. You can be heterozygous, having 1 dominant and 1 recessive, or you could be homozygous recessive, having 2 recessive alleles. There's no other combination you can get when thinking of the fact that they always come in pairs, and there's a dominant option and a recessive option. Either you have 1 of either, or you have 2 of the same, either dominant or recessive. So those are the only 3. So for these individuals, we're going to label everyone with 1 of those 3. Now, because you're remembering this part, that it's a dominant trait, that should kind of clue you in right away for at least a few of them. You don't really have to solve anything. You could just remember some of the rules. So given that Greg, Olivia, and this mystery female are not shaded, and it's a dominant trait, we know that there's only 1 option for them. Because remember, if it's a dominant trait and you are homozygous dominant, you are going to show that trait on the outside phenotypically, right? If you're heterozygous, you are still going to show that trait phenotypically. It's only when you are homozygous recessive on a dominant trait that you will not show anything. So we know right away, just by remembering some of those basic rules and that this is a dominant trait, that Greg, Olivia, and the mystery female are homozygous recessive. So I like to write it next to the shape and then draw a little circle around it, so I know it's done. So we've already figured out 3 of the 6 just by remembering some of those rules. So now we have the other 3. Tommy, his son, and then Lauren up here. So let's take it one at a time. So we've got Lauren. Now, if we didn't see any of this, we could say, just based on just Lauren and her shape and this info, we could say, okay, she could be homozygous dominant, she could be heterozygous, but looking at her offspring is probably, most of the time this works, is going to clue us in as to if we can narrow it down between those two. So let's see if we're looking at, let's look at Olivia, because we already have Olivia done. That's one of her two offspring. So let's see if Olivia, us knowing that she is homozygous recessive will clue us into what Lauren is. So Olivia is homozygous recessive. So she's getting one little A from dad and one little A from mom, right? So one little A comes from dad. That works because that's all he has to give. And so she has to get the other little A from mom. So if mom, before we saw Olivia, and we were kind of going back and forth between homozygous dominant or heterozygous, that part now lets us know that the only option for her is heterozygous, because she has to have at least one little A to be able to give to her daughter. Now, like I said, you can always rewind that and listen to it again. This so far should make sense to you. And the rest of the examples are kind of the same. Maybe the family gets a little bigger, but the rules are still the same. So then we just have Tommy and his son. So very similarly, if we were only looking at them in isolation, we didn't see the rest of the family. Simply knowing that it's a dominant trait will let us know that we're looking at either homozygous dominant or heterozygous for either of those two. But now that we have, let's see, we've got Tommy's, parents, and maybe even this other female can inform on this. So looking at Tommy's parents, we've got Greg, who is homozygous recessive. Keep forgetting I have that in my ear. And then mom, who was heterozygous. So if we're looking at Tommy, once again, we know it could be either of those two, but let's look at dad first. Dad only has little a's. So he has to give a little a to Tommy, so we can write that down. Tommy's getting at least one little a, right? Now, mom has a big A and a little a. She's got a dominant and recessive. But if mom gave Tommy her little a, Tommy would be homozygous recessive, and he would not be shaded in, right? The problem would have told us that he wasn't affected, and it told us he is, which means, once again, the only option for Tommy is that he is heterozygous. And then always double check this. I see students do this all the time. They'll start filling in the genotypes and they don't go back and actually make sure that it works, and then it's incorrect. So Tommy's getting a big A and a little a from his parents. Let's see, dad has to be the one giving him a little a because that's all dad has. Mom is the one giving him the big A. That kind of works out. And so, and then kind of the same for the very last one. It's almost the exact same situation we just saw with Tommy and his parents. We've got mystery son, and then the two parents. One is homozygous recessive, one is one is heterozygous. So it's the exact same scenario. So once again, we've got someone who is heterozygous. Now, a lot of the ones I set up, the answer is, let's say, at least half the time is heterozygous rather than homozygous dominant or homozygous recessive, just for the way I've set some of these up. They're a little easier examples, so it kind of works out that way, but not always. So don't just assume. Like this one, all three of the mystery ones that we figured out at the end were homozygous, we're heterozygous, but the first three were not. You know what I mean? So just kind of keep that in mind. Okay, so now we can move on to the second one. Now give me a moment to get like a whole setup of tools and items here. So I'm going to wipe that off and also take a sip of my soda. Okay, where did I put my pen? Okay, so now we have the next example, which is Luke and Susan. And you'll already see, we're going to go through it, but you can already see this family is going to be a little bit bigger. So we started out with kind of a smaller family, and now we're going to go into a slightly larger family. Okay, Luke and Susan. So Luke is the square, and then we've got the circle for Susan. Luke and Susan. And they have 3 children. We've got 2 females and a male. We've got Izzy, Teddy, and Ellie. So we'll do the drop down from the 2 of them, and then we'll do the 3 offspring from those. So we've got Izzy, Teddy. Sorry, it's a tiny bit sloppy, but hopefully you can see it. I might switch pins here in a second. And then Ellie. Now, If you were doing this in a computer program, that might all be perfectly straight and stuff, but that's okay for now, right? Okay. A little more info from the problem. It tells us Ellie has one son with a male. Okay, so no name on the son or the male, but we know we could put a square there and then a square down there. So that's Ellie's family. The problem also, or the example also lets us know that Teddy has no offspring, so we can just kind of leave Teddy alone. And then it lets us know that Izzy has 2 daughters. So it doesn't mention the male, but of course we know we don't clone ourselves as humans. We're a sexually reproducing species. So there's going to be a square over there for the male. And then we've got 2 daughters. So here we have, let me see, here we have the entire family. So a little bit bigger than the last one. Before we only had 6 members of the family. Now we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So a bit bigger, right? But the rules are all the same. It just might take us an extra minute or 2 to figure it out. Okay, so now it's letting us know that this is a recessive trait. Remember, I said to always pay attention to this part. Is it a dominant trait or is it a recessive trait? Because that is going to influence how we label everybody. And it lets us know that Luke is affected. So you guys know we're going to shade in Luke. Shade in Luke. So I'm like, my arms are weak. I'm trying to hold this thing up. Let's see. So are Teddy and Izzy. So we'll shade in Teddy. Izzy. One of Izzy's daughters, it lets us know. You just pick whichever one you want. So you don't have names. And Ellie is also affected. Okay. So that's everyone who is affected by this recessive trait. And then for clarity, it lets us know that no other family member is affected. So this is it. And then, of course, the very last bullet point, what are the genotypes for each individual? So remember, genotypes are whether you are homozygous dominant, heterozygous, or homozygous recessive. Now, just like before, where we kind of remembered one of the rules and was able to just kind of label a handful of the people, we can probably do that again. Now, if it's a recessive trait, this is where a lot of the students kind of get confused. So this is important to remember that if it's a dominant or recessive trait, who gets shaded in often is different, right? So if you're looking at a dominant trait, people who are shaded in express that dominant trait. If you're looking at a recessive trait, people who are shaded in are expressing the recessive trait, right? Okay. So that kind of guides us in this, that if Luke, Izzy, Teddy, and Ellie, and then this mystery daughter are all affected, they are physically showing this recessive trait, there's only one way that that can happen. It is if they are all homozygous recessive, right? There cannot be a dominant allele masking it. So right away, just because we remembered some of those rules, we can label those 5 individuals, half the people, we can label them as homozygous recessive, or little a, or 2 recessive alleles, or 2 little a. Now you can use whatever letter, and I know I mentioned this on the previous lecture, that you want to pick any letter that, or where the uppercase and lowercase look drastically different. So A is a good one, B is good, R is good. Unfortunately, in some of the textbooks I've used along, over the semesters, especially some of the lab books, have used letters that I tell my students specifically not to use, and it's really frustrating. Don't use C, don't use S, don't use F, even though they look a little different, they're still really close, right? Don't use T, anything that looks the same or looks really close to the same, because all it takes is, one student's handwriting that's a little sloppier, or, you know what I mean? Not that it's not a value judgment, it's just, it is what it is. Then the whole answer can end up being or looking correct, right? So I don't care what letter it is, Q, what's another good one? G, whatever. As long as the uppercase and lowercase look different. So even if you made them the same size, they would still look different. Okay, so now going back to that, because we remembered and paid attention to what kind of trait it was, recessive versus dominant, we've already figured out half the people, you know. So now we can kind of go through the other 5, those 5 who are not shaded, and once again, kind of, but almost a little differently, we now know that those who are not shaded can be either homozygous dominant or heterozygous. So let's see if we can narrow that down. So we can look at Susan. We've got all of Susan's offspring and her mate. So we should be able to figure her out pretty easily. All of Susan's offspring are all homozygous recessive. They all have only little a's. Each of them has 2. That's it. Now, Luke is also homozygous recessive. So that means because all the offspring are getting one thing from dad and one from mom, that they're obviously all getting a little a from dad because that's all he has, right? So their other little a has to come from mom. So if before we saw that though, we were like, okay, Susan could be, if we only saw her in isolation, Susan could be homozygous dominant or heterozygous. Now we know it can't be heterozygous. Oh my God, my Lord. Let me say that again. Before, in isolation, if we saw Susan, we would have said she is either heterozygous or homozygous dominant. But now seeing all of her offspring and knowing that they all have to get a little a from mom, the only option of those 2 that would make sense then is that Susan is heterozygous. Heterozygous, right? So you're solving a little puzzle. If you like puzzles or like Sudoku or any of that stuff, you know, I think this is kind of in that similar, you like have to kind of solve a mystery a little bit, you know, not too difficult, but that's still kind of part of it. Let's try Izzy, because we've got one of the offspring, so that might help us. Okay, so we've got Izzy, who is homozygous recessive, and the daughter, one of the daughters at least, is homozygous recessive. So let's see if that can clue us into what dad is at least. Now, dad, once again, in isolation, without looking at anyone, we would know automatically that he's either homozygous dominant or heterozygous, right? He can't be homozygous recessive because if he were, he'd be shaded in, and he's not. And the problem let us know that. So it's only between those first 2. But seeing that the offspring, at least one of them, one of the daughters, is homozygous recessive, that means she's getting one little a from mom, which works because that's all Izzy has. She has to be getting the other little a from dad. So once again, this individual has to be heterozygous. And then with this last daughter right here, let's see if we can narrow that down. We've got, once again, not shaded, so it can only be homozygous dominant or heterozygous. Has to get a little a from mom because that's all mom has. So she's getting at least one little a. Can't get another little a from dad, otherwise she'd be shaded, and we know she's not. So she has to be getting the big A from dad to also be heterozygous. Okay, and then now we've just got Ellie's family over here. So kind of similarly to over here, kind of like we don't know who the mate, but the mate is, we don't know what the offspring is. But we do have Ellie. So if we look at the offspring, once again, kind of similarly, we know that Ellie's giving a little a to the son because that's all Ellie has. So the son's getting at least one little a. And then from the dad, could either, you know, just in isolation, we might think, okay, dad is, or I'm like tilting it, dad is either homozygous dominant or heterozygous. Well, in this case, the son has to get a big A, right, from dad. If son got a little a from dad, son will be shaded, and he's not. The problem let us know he's definitely not shaded. So that means dad has to have at least a big A, right, because that's what the son has to have. So the son is definitely heterozygous. But can we narrow down this mystery man that Ellie has mated with? Now, sometimes this will happen, and especially in a large family, there might be, you know, maybe 1 out of 10 or 1 out of 15 where you technically, unless they have maybe another kid, you can't really narrow it down because dad just needs one big A and the whole thing works. So that means dad could be homozygous dominant or heterozygous. Either one of them, he wouldn't be shaded, and either one of them would work for this, right? So in this case, we'd have to say could be both. Now I'll tell you, I have students see that example there and say, oh, I can just label everyone as 2 of them. I don't have to narrow it down. That's not the case. Now, I don't always do this, but I did this one as an example for you. But let's say I give you an assignment, the worksheet, you know, whatever it is, something where I'm like, redo one of these. Very likely, if it's a small family, there won't be one like that. But if the family's bigger, I might put one in. It just depends, right? So if you see more than one like that, you know you're, in my class at least, that it's wrong. You can't have like 5 of the 10 people labeled as, oh, I can't tell. It just means you're not actually doing the work, right? It can happen rarely, and that's why I put it in here as an example, but it's a lot less likely to happen. But hopefully this makes sense to everyone. Okay, so let's do at least one more together. Give me a moment to, like, talking, parched. Plus it is ridiculously hot, and I'm filming these during the summer. I think today was like 1:15 or something. I was outside earlier. It's freaking crazy. Okay. Yeah, I'm gonna switch pins. Let me see if I can get a, well, let's see if this one works better. Let me oh, it's like almost the same. I'll use it. It's a smidge darker. Okay. So let's go to the next one where we have Claire and Jamie. And if you are a fan of Outlander, as I am, you will recognize all of the names here. And also the other names that I use are actually people that I know, like the Luke and Susan example, and their kids, Teddy, Izzy, and Ellie. Those are my 2 friends, Luke and Susan, and they have their pets. Their pets are those names. It kind of works out because their pets kind of have like human names. Like my 2 dogs that well, they recently passed. It's so hard to say because it's been very recent, but they were Waffle and Alice. So one had a very human name, one, didn't really. But Waffle had just turned 18 and Alice was just shy of 18. So they had very long lives. But I would get questions a lot like, why does one have a very human name and one like it does not, like Alice and Waffle? But those are the names they had when we got them at the shelter. So we just kept them because they both were about a year old and they responded to the names, but it was always funny. Because because also, and I'm sure some of you probably do this with your pets, where I would say, oh, the girls, I got to get the girls, or I got to pick up the girls, or I have to like go home to the girls. And people would say, oh, you have kids. And I'm like, oh, no, I'm sorry. No, those are my dogs. But if I was like, oh, the girls, Alice and Waffle, so I've had this happen at least twice where someone was like, Waffle, that's the name of your kid? I'm like, no. That's kind of funny. Okay. So now we've got Claire and Jamie. So we'll start. And it doesn't matter which order you put the female or the male. It's like whatever. So we've got Claire. Is that pen a little better? It's barely a little better. That's fine. I've got a black one around here somewhere. I gotta find it. Okay. So they have 3 children, Marcelly, Brianna, and Fergus. So we've got 2 females and a male. Of course it's not working. My life. Okay. Let's go back to the other one. Yeah, it's like barely different. We've got Marcelly. Oops. Brianna. And Fergus. This is ridiculously crooked. Hold on. Sorry about that. It's fine, right? You guys can figure it out. Fergus is like super low and crooked. That's fine. Okay. Marcelly has 1 child with John. Okay, so Marcelly and John. Okay. Oh, the child. I forgot the child. Oh, the child's name is Henri, a male. Henri. And then Brianna has no offspring, so we can just leave Brianna by herself. And then Fergus has a child, Faith. Now, didn't mention the female he mated with, but obviously we know that's how it works, so don't forget that. And then they have a child, a female, named Faith. Okay. So hopefully you're doing this as we go, so you can draw your own and make sense to you. Okay. Now we've got the last bullet point, which is set up. This one's set up a bit differently than the others. So we've got, it says, oh, hold on, let me adjust this, my screen. Sorry. Okay, Claire and Jamie are homozygous dominant. So it hasn't told us if it's a dominant or recessive trait yet, but it's letting us know that Claire and Jamie are homozygous dominant. So at this one, unlike the others, is giving us a genotype right away. So we can say Claire and Jamie, we can both label them as homozygous dominant. We don't know who we're shading yet, that's fine. But we can label them both with big A, right? Big A for Jamie and the glare. I'm so sorry about the glare. There we go. Better, sort of. Okay. Faith is heterozygous, so Faith is down here at the bottom. So she is hetero. Okay. John is the only family member. This is an important part. John is the only family member not affected by the dominant allele. So it's giving us a lot of information. It's telling us, one, we're looking at a dominant trait. It's dominant, right? And it's telling us John is not affected, so he's not going to be shaded, right? But it's telling us John is the only one not affected. And remember, affected means, whether it's a dominant or recessive trait, affected means they are showing it on their outside, which means they get shaded in. So that sentence is letting us know everyone gets shaded except for John. So I'll just do it this way. I'm going to shade in everyone except for John.
Yeah, can you click on it, see if you get an error? You don't have permission. Yeah, it might just be
just give me 1 second. I'm sure it takes a second for you as well to shade these in. Marcelly. Everyone except John. Everyone except John is affected. He's the only one not affected by this dominant trait. So that also lets us know, that can help, it gives us a clue as to how we're going to label John. And then it says, the next part, what are the genotypes, right? So John we can figure out right away, because remember, the only three options are homozygous dominant, heterozygous, or homozygous recessive, right? Those are the only three options. So for John, if it's a dominant trait, anyone who's shaded could be either homozygous dominant or heterozygous, right? The only way you don't get shaded in a dominant trait is if you are homozygous recessive. Since John's the only one, we know right away John is homozygous recessive. So now let's see, we've got Claire and Jamie done. We've got Faith and John done. So we've already got 4. We just have to figure out everyone else. So this one should be a little easy in terms of the offspring of Claire and Jamie. Claire and Jamie are both homozygous dominant. They only have big A's. That's all they have, which means that's the only thing they can give to every one of their offspring. So for Marcelly, Brianna, and Fergus, they're going to get 1 big A from mom because that's all she has, and they're going to get another big A from dad because that's all he has. So just like their parents, Marcelly, Brianna, and Fergus are all going to be homozygous dominant. So we can write that next to them. Homozygous dominant. So that means all we have to figure out is Henri and then Fergus's mate. This one was, even though it was a little more, is different, this one was a little easier, I think. And Fergus and Henri, I'm sorry, Fergus's mate and Henri. So let's do Henri first. We've got mom and dad both done. Dad is John and he's homozygous recessive. Mom is Marcelly and she's homozygous dominant. So that means dad only has little A's to give and mom only has big A's to give. So Henri's going to get 1 big A from mom and then 1 little A from dad, right? So Henri is going to be heterozygous. And there's only 1 left, Fergus's mate, Faith's mother. So we have Fergus, who was homozygous dominant, and Faith, who is heterozygous. So let's see if that can clue us into what the female is. Now, she's shaded, so we know she can't be homozygous recessive. She has to be either homozygous dominant or heterozygous. So let's look at Fergus. Fergus is homozygous dominant, which means that he only has big A's. So Faith, who has a big A, we know it had to have come from her dad, right? Because that's all he has. So that means Faith is getting her little a from mom. So now we know that mom has to be heterozygous. Hopefully you were following along and this makes a lot of sense to you. So typically on the exam, there is a question regarding the pedigree. I kind of go back and forth with whether I have you make the pedigree from scratch the way we just did here, or if I have the pedigree set up for you and I ask you questions about it. So either one of those might be something that happens on the exam. But as long as you remember those rules of like dominant versus recessive and when and how you shade the individuals, you're going to get the answer, right? Whether I make you do it from scratch or whether there's already one and you have to answer questions about it. Let's see, I'm not going to hit every slide, but let's see the general thing next that I want to, so these two rules, Bergman's rule and Allen's rule. So Bergman's rule basically is that when looking at cold environments specifically, the limbs or the arms and the legs, now this could be for humans, this could be for, bear, whatever, mammals, let's say. In colder environments, their limbs or their arms and their torso, that's the main focus for Bergman's rule, their torso is going to be a little bit more compact, more robust often, kind of depending on the directionality, and have a little bit more body fat. So when you think of animals who are in cold environments, this should not surprise you. They're typically not very long or lanky. As mammals, they tend to be more shorter, a little more robust, maybe with some fat, but not super tall. They don't have a stretched out torso, right? This is kind of connected to the other rule, which is Allen's rule, which is the one that talks about the limbs. So Allen's rule says specifically that in warm environments, limbs tend to be much more longer, and not even just arms and legs. Thinking of other mammals, like we have a really good example out here with a desert hare. Not only are their arms and legs longer, but their ears, so like another appendage, their ears are really long too, right? So this is in contrast to like a bunny you might see in the snow, very cold environment, where arms, legs, ears are going to be short, body's going to be more rounded and kind of compact, more fat on it. So Allen's rule and Bergman's rule in terms of mammals tends to hold true. Now you might be thinking in your mind right now already of maybe an exception to this. Now, of course, this is nature is doing whatever it's doing. We as humans are trying to figure out what are some of the rules that can be applied, to nature, and these two tend to be true. But remember, this is really important, is that when we're looking at the natural selection process, it's never just about one trait and one environmental factor, right? You could say like the environment of Las Vegas, and you could list probably 1,000 factors to the environment, right? Because it's basically everything beyond the physical body. And also within the physical body, in terms of physical traits, you could list 1,000, at a minimum. And so you have to remember that all of those traits and all those environmental factors are all affecting each other, right? So when we say this rule tends to hold true, it's like, yes, of course, when we're simplifying it and saying, here's this one trait, limb proportions or torso, and we're looking at, one environmental factor of whether it's warm or whether it's cold, these rules tend to be true. But you're always looking at more than just that. So like as an example, like almost like a kind of an exception to this would be, or just, considering the other factors, would be looking at humans who live in really cold environments like Nordic Europe. They don't tend to be short, they tend to be tall, right? So they tend to be more robust and larger, but they also tend to be elongated, at least in like, their height. And so you're like, okay, Allen or Bergman's rule doesn't quite fit with that, although we do see Bergman's rule affecting plenty of human populations. But like that's kind of an interesting exception. Well, of course, people researched this and realized, well, actually a lot of the reasons why the Bergman's rule doesn't quite fit with them, at least not fully the way we see it with other mammals, is that they live on, like it has to do with their diet. They have specific things in their diet in that region. And so that can affect other things, like amongst a bunch of other factors, right? So, like I said, the rules tend to hold true, Bergman's and Allen's rule, but there will always be interesting ways of evaluating that and taking into account other factors as well. Dark skin and light skin adaptation. This is always an interesting one. So I think most people are aware, maybe not though, that the reason why we see like the coloring of our skin, let's say if we're looking at just humans, but this is true for mammals, but let's say we're looking at just humans as an example because we are a very globalized species, so we have a lot more variation for most traits, not even just, skin tone. But when you look at the different environments we inhabit, of course, our bodies, skin tone being one of them, is going to be affected by the environment. And so this is, to simplify it, basically the amount of UV radiation you're getting, whether you're living close to the equator or further away or in certain regions of the world, is going to be different. And that's a huge factor of how like our skin tone will, appear. And so basically, if you live in an area where there's a high amount of sun exposure or a high amount of UV radiation, your skin will be darker to be able to combat that essentially. So when we think of like if we think of sun exposure like in 2026, we all are very aware of like wearing SPF, especially living in Vegas, right? You don't want to get skin cancer because even in 2026 skin cancer can still kill you. But obviously you don't want to have any medical issues, so we're all very aware of protecting ourselves against at least that one thing like skin cancer, right? And so most of us, I think that in general in the population, but definitely like for us in Vegas, we're very like hyper aware of wearing sunscreen, SPF, something. Even a lot of our makeup has SPF kind of built into it, which is cool. So we're aware of this. So in the past, this would have been the case that those individuals who had, let's say there's a human population going into an environment that's warmer and warmer, they're migrating or something, and some individuals in that environment have maybe medium toned skin, some have lighter skin, some have darker skin. After a handful of generations, those individuals who had the darker skin tone are going to be the ones who are surviving and thriving, even if just a little better than the others, and reproducing more offspring. So after, hundreds or thousands or hundreds of thousands of years, you're going to see that population, the skin getting darker and darker and darker because of that thing. Now that's just looking at one thing, protection against cancer, because imagine you get skin cancer, you're going to either, maybe die right away, maybe you linger, maybe you have it for a long time, but the chances of you surviving, thriving, and reproducing, even if it's only like 5% less, over enough time, you're going to see those individuals, the lighter skin tone, or even maybe the medium skin tone, are not going to be surviving and thriving and reproducing as well as those with the darker skin. Like I knew someone who, this was just, I don't know, like 20 years ago, who had skin cancer, and because they were young, they basically didn't tell anyone. And it wasn't until a family member saw like a growth on them, they were like, you need to go to the doctor. And so they went to the doctor and found out it was skin cancer. And on the outside, it looked like a really large mole, but it had grown all the way internally. So this individual had to have like part of their leg removed, like a big part of the muscle and skin removed, part of like their side and their back, because it had spread all into that. And they also only had I think it was like a 90% chance of, or I'm sorry, like a 10% chance of survival. They did, but so even in that, like current times, we think of skin cancer, like it can still devastate you. You can imagine in the past with no oncologists, those things would have, and he was 19, 20, 17, something like that. So very young. So, either in the past would have had maybe few offspring or no offspring, so less likely. Yeah. So, and of course, we know that can affect you at any age. In contrast to that, before I move on, sorry, I want to say one more thing, is that the high amounts of UV radiation can also cause a breakdown in folate. Now, in Las Vegas or like in the U.S., we tend to not think about, at least not severe deficiencies in vitamins, because fortunately a lot of our food is fortified. Like you can go to the grocery store and get like maybe not even the healthiest thing, and it's going to have like added into it like some vitamin A, some vitamin D, something like that. So a lot of our food is fortified, per the government and whatnot. Not all of it, but a lot of it is. So you could even have not maybe the best diet, and if let's say you were living in Las Vegas, but you'd probably still get, not all, but a decent amount of the vitamins that you would need, at least not to have, let's say, a severe deficiency that we might see in other, parts of the world. Now, you can still get a severe deficiency if you're inside all the time, you never go outside. Like, that's going to be a problem, right? If you eat no vegetables or fruit, that's probably going to be an issue, but everyone's different. It's going to affect everyone differently, right? But in the past, obviously, because we live in a very globalized economy. So you could go to the grocery store and get food from around the world. But in the past, you would have had only the food in your region available to you. So if you happen to be in a region where the variety of food and vitamins available or minerals available was lacking one item or another, you might have to be dependent on something else to be able to see that, like the sun, getting vitamin D, etc. So in this sense of having a high amount of UV radiation breaking down certain vitamins, in this case folate, that can actually lead to, like in a severe case, could lead to what we call a spontaneous abortion. Now, the more common term for a spontaneous abortion is a miscarriage, right? Which, hold on. This has, that's kind of a whole other topic, right? We could have a whole interesting conversation. And if we were in class, we could have an interesting back and forth about it. But miscarriages are very common. A lot of women have had one and never knew it, right? It's just females, not even just humans, but mammals in general. It's like kind of just part of the biological process that it's, happens a lot more in mammals than most people realize. Anyway, but obviously, if we're looking at the evolutionary process and reproduction as kind of the main focal point, if there is something that directly affects your ability to reproduce successfully, natural selection is going to, say, whoa, what's going on here? So right away, that darker skin tone is super beneficial when you're living in a warm environment with a lot of UV radiation, drastically reducing your chances of getting certain types of cancers and also increasing your chances of reproducing successfully. So if you live in an area, especially in the past, right, where all of these, because people would live in certain areas for generation after generation after generation, where you would see these changes occur, that having dark skin in those areas would be super beneficial. In contrast, if you're living in other parts of the world where the UV radiation is very low, having lighter skin ends up being a huge benefit. So basically, if you live in an area where you're not getting a lot of vitamin D, most of the time for us, that comes from the sun. If you're living in an area where you're not getting enough sun, it's very cloudy, et cetera, having a lighter skin tone to be able to absorb as much of that vitamin D as you can is going to be super beneficial. Because vitamin D, you might be thinking, well, what does vitamin D even do, right? So vitamin D is very important. One of the more important parts is that it helps in the absorption of calcium into like your body. So, nowadays you can't even really go to like the pharmacy and get a calcium supplement that doesn't already have vitamin D like already included. You usually see calcium plus D. And as females, you should definitely, even really at your early and mid 20s, start on a calcium supplement if you're not consciously making that a huge part of your diet, because our chances of getting osteoporosis are obviously higher than in men, and we tend to live longer, so that's more likely to happen for us. And it could be devastating in your older age, and not even like you're not even have to be like 90. It could be much earlier than that, where your bone it becomes very important. But also, calcium is not even just about bone health. It also helps like the heart and the nervous system. It's like vital for a lot of things, so you need a lot of it. So having vitamin D aiding in that process is like super vital. So to be able to take in enough vitamin D is really important. Like in an extreme deficiency, let's say you as the mother, you're gestating a fetus, you were getting like no vitamin D, and that offspring upon being born is still not getting enough vitamin D. There can be major problems with how the bones form for that individual. So when you're born, your bones, like you've seen this in babies, their bones are all kind of bendy. It's because the bones aren't even in one bone yet. They're like in pieces of bone. They're not even often connected. Some of it's connected by cartilage, some of it's not connected at all. And so those bones will form into one solid bone. And it's usually at a very particular time rate. But if the correct nutrients aren't there, the shape that it takes might be incorrect. And so you can see on some of these slides, this disease or result of that, it's called osteomalacia or rickets. is basically the result of having a severe vitamin D deficiency. Lot less likely to happen in, like, Las Vegas or the US. It can, but significantly less likely because, like I said, a lot of our foods are fortified. Not everyone, of course, but many people have access to like prenatal vitamins. I mean, that's kind of a conversation as well, access and all that. But the options are there for the majority of people, and so tends to not happen. But it still totally could. It definitely happens in other parts of the world. So that bone is going to form into a shape, but if it doesn't get the right nutrients, it's going to form off not into a straight bone if it's supposed to be straight, but a curved bone. Which, if it's in the legs, which typically it is, it's going to cause major issues with your ability to walk, your gait without pain, without having to have some kind of assisted device. So it's just, you can imagine in the past environment, if you had a massive limp as like either an early Homo sapien or even like pre-Homo sapien, might mean you're what the lion gets to eat, or something. Now our culture set up a bit differently. We have newer technologies where you would say, oh, I just need to use a wheelchair or maybe a cane. Once again, access, but anyway, so you can kind of see how just sun exposure, just UV radiation exposure in a bunch of different ways can be, can be very influential. Okay, so I'm talked way longer than I wanted. That's fine. I had to do the drawing, so that's kind of it. You can go through the rest of the PowerPoint and kind of look through the details, but I'll kind of stop the video here. Yeah, so I will see you guys all on the next one.